Rural Heritage on RFD TV is brought to you by Rural Heritage Magazine, a bi-monthly magazine featuring articles about farming and logging with draft animal power, small-scale diversified family farming and homesteading, and other aspects of our rich rural heritage. Rural Heritage Magazine, borrowing from yesterday to do the work of today. For subscription information, please call 319-362-3027 or order online at www.ruralheritage.com. Hi, I'm Joe Mishka, welcoming you to another episode of Rural Heritage TV. I first met Bob Kroeger a couple years ago after he just published his Historic Barns of Ohio book. In that book, Bob visited each of Ohio's 88 counties to tell the story of a historic barn there and the people who built it. He went on to make a painting of each barn, and many of those are also in the book. When I heard Bob had finished another barn book, this time about round barns, I went to visit him to learn about the project. We met at a round barn in southern Indiana, which Bob explained is known as the wedding cake barn. It was a snowy, cold day, but worth the trip.
Hello, I'm Bob Kroeger, and I write about old barns and paint their pictures in order to preserve the early history of America and the sacrifices that the barn builders did, and all that history. And this particular barn is in my new book called Round Barns of America, and it's a round barn. I call it the wedding cake. And I call it the wedding cake because it looks like a wedding cake, and other writers have used that term. And it traces back a long ways to 1755, when the oldest patriarch of this family was born near Philadelphia. He was a frontiersman, just like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton, and he also served for the American side in the Revolutionary War. And after the war, he settled in Kentucky, and he raised a family of 12 children. One of his children had a long name. I better read this to you, because I don't have it memorized. And he was Narcus Baron Steuben Isaac Henry Fielding Lewis Plickenstolver. What a mouthful. Well, they called him Fielding for short, thank God. And his son, Fielding Jr., moved to this county, Decatur County, Indiana. And his grandson was Strowther Van Pleek. They shortened the last name and the first name, making life a lot easier for that family. And he built this barn in 1908. It's a circular barn, and it does look like a wedding cake, and it wasn't in great shape when the current owner purchased it in 1996. 3 years earlier, it made the National Register of Historic Places. So it's a very famous barn. And at that time, they raised crops, and they raised horses and mules. And they sold mules to the army. And little Strowther was a pretty sharp little kid. And when the army inspector came around to inspect the mules, he'd always look in the mouth, because the mouth was a good indicator of the health of the animal. And if the mule happened to be missing a few front teeth, little Strowther, who was 7 at the time, would pipe up, "Dad, is that the mule where you knocked the front teeth out of?" He was a smart kid. So anyway, he ended up raising a family here, farming and building this wonderful barn. Richard Reed, who's in the book, thank goodness, because unfortunately he couldn't be here today because he passed away about a year ago, purchased this farm in an auction in 1996. He spent a lot of money restoring it because the foundation was not in good shape. Well, he has done a service not only to the local people or the people of Indiana, but nationwide. This is a beautiful, beautiful barn. It's one of the nicest, and it's on the front cover of the book. And Richard's picture is actually inside the book, so I'm very happy with that.
If you enjoy seeing how our ancestors lived during America's rural yesterday, you're going to love looking at these books. Volume 1 is Fieldwork, showing horses and vintage tractors preparing seed beds, planting, cultivating, and harvesting the crop. Volume 2 shows the work being done in the barn and farmyard, feeding and watering the livestock, getting the crop into the barn, milking the cows, shearing the sheep, and collecting the eggs. In Volume 3, we go inside the home to see the family in the kitchen canning vegetables, in the parlor listening to the radio, and in the dining room for family supper. We also head into town to shop at the general store or visit on the town square on Saturday night. Each book has over 140 large format pages. They sell for $24.95 each, or you can buy 2 for $44.95, or all 3 for $54.95 plus shipping. Call 1-877-647-2452 to order. That's 1-877-647-2452.
So why round barns? Such an odd shape, and the term round barns encompasses not only circular barns, but octagonals and 10-sided and even 16-sided barns. Anything but a right angle. So the shape of the circle traces back, at least in modern history, to the Greeks. And they built many round temples. And that rubbed off on the Romans, who came a little bit later. And they built a wonderful structure in Rome called the Pantheon. And that has been studied and copied many, many times. It's circular. It's a beautiful building. And they had colosseums, round colosseums, not octagonal, not rectangular, not oblong, but round colosseums, all hundreds of them, all throughout their empires. So that was a start. The next significant part is the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And during the time of the Crusades, there were crusaders from England, from France, from Italy, who would go as a pilgrimage to this holy temple, and that was round, you see. So the English especially took this round concept back, and they built round churches right around 1100 AD in England. So there were, I would say there were probably maybe a couple dozen, maybe more than that. There's one still standing actually in London. And from there, we come back to the colonies. In the early 1770s, Thomas Jefferson, who later became a founding father, was obsessed with the octagonal shape, obsessed with it. Thomas Jefferson was a great reader, and he loved history. He loved architecture. In fact, he's considered the father of American architecture, believe it or not. Well, he was a big farmer like George Washington was, and they came from families with a lot of money. Well, after the war and his wife died, he was sent over to Paris as an envoy and ambassador, and he became really interested in the architecture in Paris. And there was one particular building going up close to where he stayed, which had the octagonal shape. He traveled throughout France on his own dime, and he saw a lot of interesting buildings. Well, he became close friends with a lady named Angelica Church, and Angelica Church became good friends with him. And when I visited her barn, which was 9-sided, which is in western New York, about 7 hours from Cincinnati, she probably was influenced by Thomas Jefferson and his octagonal shape. Well, she was also the sister-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, who married her sister, Elizabeth. So that's part of the oldest round barn story in America, which is in western New York today. Well, the next person involved in this round barn concept was a fellow named Orson Fowler, and he was a phrenologist, which is a crazy, weird science, but he lectured widely. And his concept of the perfect house, the perfect shape, was a circle, but he realized that was difficult to build, so he stressed the octagon. And from his lectures, he's inspired a lot of people to build octagonal homes, even as far west as Minnesota. So he had an influence, but even though he wrote a little bit and published a little bit about octagonal barns, it didn't catch on. Until another New Yorker, he's a little further north in upstate New York, Elliot Stewart, came on the scene. And he was an attorney, but he didn't like that very much, so he became a farmer. And 4 of his rectangular barns burned down. So somehow he got the idea, I'm not sure how or from where, to build an octagonal barn which replaced all of those 4 that had burned down. Well, he was also a part-time professor at the Ag College at Cornell University. So he got his ideas published. And there were octagonal barns built right after this, which was 1875, not only in New York State, but in Ohio and Indiana and as far west as Iowa. But that was again, a small percentage, and it kind of died out. And the last person involved in this is Franklin King, who was an interesting guy from Wisconsin. He was also associated with the Ag School at the University of Wisconsin. And in 1889, his brother-in-law asked him to design a round barn to house all of his dairy cows. At the time, Wisconsin and Minnesota had switched from wheat to dairying. So they figured a round barn would be ideal for dairying. So Professor King built a round barn and publicized it widely. He also put a silo in the barn, a central silo. And this was a new concept too. There weren't many silos before this. So after he built this circular barn, the round barns probably started to be interesting in the 1890s, and even more so in 1900, even though there were negative articles in ag newspapers about the disadvantages, and the 1920s, and they stopped for the most part in the 1930s. So anyway, it's a small piece of history. The round barns are way less than 1%. And I'm happy I captured 75 of them in my book, Round Barns of America.
You've seen our America's Rural Yesterday 3-book set covering life on the farm in the early 1900s. We're excited to bring you a 4th edition to the series, Early Tractors, featuring more than 250 photos of early American tractors like Alice Chalmers, Oliver, John Deere, Farmall, Minneapolis Moline, and lots more. Most of the photos are of new or almost new tractors back in the day, showing exactly how they were configured when they came out of the factory. Tractor collectors, history buffs, and folks simply wanting to reminisce about farm life in America's Rural Yesterday will love to have this book. It sells for $24.95 plus shipping. If you buy more than one book in the series, the price per book goes down all the way to $69.95 for all 4 books. To order, call toll-free 877-647-2452 or visit www.mishka.com. That's 1-877-647-2452.
When he built this in 1908, he didn't build the barn first. He built the octagonal cement silo first, which still stands today. It's the center of the barn. And that was a little bit different from the way most people built round barns. So the cement silo is still here and it's still working, even though they don't use it today. Richard very, very kindly has placed a lot of antique farm equipment in here, some related to his fertilizer company, Kova, which he did a wonderful job on. And as you can see, there are many features like this ladder leading all the way to the top of the granary. So this is where they stored the grain and kept it fairly warm during the cold Indiana winters, as it is today.
Would they have kept grain here or silage?
Probably silage for the most part. Maybe a section might have been something they used for grain, but yeah, mostly the silage. Yeah, they've got a hay mow right here, and you can see a trap door. So somebody went down below to feed the cattle. It's a shame Richard isn't here. He could have explained in detail exactly what each one of these is. This is some type of a
It's a cider press.
A cider press for apples, I guess.
Yeah, and here's the apple butter.
And that's where they cook the apple butter. Yep. Oh, a bathtub.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique one.
Well, that's a unique bathtub.
It is.
It's like a history lesson just walking around this barn.
Yeah, there's some great pieces here.
Feeding trough.
Cedar. This is made to
Oh,
plant.
yes, even the pictures, yes.
Oh, okay.
There is
so
an
he's
action.
spreading lime out of it. That's what it's
Yeah.
for. It goes on the back of a wagon. It's a nice piece. What are they doing with this barn now?
I think it was Richard's pride and joy. The family knows that. They realize that he spent an awful lot of money, probably 30 years ago, restoring this barn, and I don't think they want it taken down. They don't use it, but with all the memorabilia, it's like a little museum. So I'm sure they'll have school children out here to try to explain what the old barns were used for and what some of the equipment here is for. So
The chairs and tables downstairs got me thinking that maybe they use it for events.
I hope they do. I just mentioned to Lisa that I'd be happy to do a fundraiser for them.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's an early tipping rake. Goes both directions. Flips over. That's a really nice one.
As you can see, the floor's in pretty good shape.
It's in terrific shape.
Yeah, and they've done a great job to preserve it. The roof is the Achilles heel to any barn, and if the roof's in good shape, the barn usually lasts.
Right.
If the roof has holes in it, then water gets in, it leaks, it rots the timbers out, and bingo,
Yep, exactly.
don't have much of a barn.
That's exactly.
I think this is when Richard took it over in 1996. 3 years earlier, made the National Register, and it was painted red at the time. And this barn doesn't look like it's in bad shape, but it was in really bad shape. And Richard had to make a decision because he only had so much money. So he decided to take down the conventional barn and save the unique round barn, which he did. And he painted it white, put a new coat of paint on it, and he's proud of it because the original deed signed by John Quincy Adams, 1827, is right here. And that goes to, again, the grandson of Fielding, whose name was Narcus Baron Steuben Isaac Henry Fielding Louis Plekenstaver. Yeah, they called him Fielding for short. So he's kept this old lineage because it was very important to him. Hopefully it'll be important to his sons and their sons in the future. So I'm sure there were stanchions arranged here along the perimeter.
What is the utility of a round barn in terms of it being economical for its for the footprint for a dairy farm?
The proponents would always emphasize the fact that round barns could hold more than a rectangular barn. In fact, Indiana, the state of Indiana, had probably more round barn builders than any other state. And these boys went east and west, and they were missionaries for the round barn. In fact, there was one clever person in Illinois who was a school teacher, but he decided he would also build these round barns. And he was a pretty good salesman too. When he would come into a farmhouse and talk to the owners who were very skeptical about building a round barn, he would take a little cardboard box, which was shaped as a rectangle, and pour oats in it. And then he'd use the same box, but he would make a round circle out of it, and he could get more oats into it. It was a slam dunk. He was a good salesman. He was pretty smart. But I think at least in Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, The main purpose of a round barn was for dairy cows, because they could arrange the stanchions on the perimeter of the barn, and that made it easy to feed milk. They had cement troughs so the manure would be washed down to a central area. They had all kinds of different devices, but I would say that was the main part. Now, when George Washington built his barn in 1794, it wasn't for dairying, because Washington, who was a consummate farmer and would have much rather been a farmer than a president, decided that he wanted to switch, because at the time, all the Virginia gentleman farmers were what they called planters. They did raise tobacco. That was the cash crop. But Washington was ahead of his time in farming, and he realized that the constant tobacco was depleting the soil. So he switched to wheat. So he needed a threshing barn. In those days, when you had to thresh the wheat, you did it outside. And you used a long rod called a flail, and you banged it and banged it and banged it. Well, there was dirt in the ground, it could rain. So he designed this round barn, 16-sided, probably an offshoot of Jefferson's concept of the octagon being the perfect shape. And inside this two-story barn, he had an octagonal central area, which was a granary, and he would have somebody lead the horses over the wheat, round and round this octagon in the middle of the barn. Well, he left an 1.5 inch gap in between the floorboards so the kernels would fall straight down, and he could process the load of wheat every 45 minutes, or 6 to 7 acres a day. It was a hugely economic barn, and unfortunately, that barn was destroyed in the 1870s, but it was rebuilt in '96 thanks to a generous grant from the Kellogg Foundation of $2 million. And if you go to Mount Vernon, Virginia, you'll see it. It's still there. So, a lot of wonderful.
Checked corn equipment. This would be.
Well, Richard, you aren't here, but your memory is here. And I think he told me that he would have school children and school groups out here. And that's what all these photos are for. So hopefully his children will continue that tradition and teach the young children not only about farming, but about the rare small percentage of barns that were built either octagonal or 16-sided or circular.
Your next project is a brick,
stone barn. Yeah, my next, I'm working on stone barns where all 4 walls are stone, not just the foundation, but stone. And I was a little worried because there were so many wonderful stories that came out about the round barns that I would not be able to match those, but I've found some interesting stories, really incredible stories. They're in a few more states, maybe over 40 states compared to 32 states in the Round Barn book, but some of the stories are very, very good, so I'm very happy.
You're staying very busy.
Yeah, that's what I do.
This program is available for purchase. To order your copy, please call 319-362-3027 or visit www.ruralheritage.com. Rural Heritage is a bi-monthly magazine dedicated to draft animal farming and logging, as well as other aspects of our rich rural heritage. It is published by Mishka Press, which also offers a complete line of back-to-the-land books, DVDs, and calendars. Call or write for a catalog or subscription information, or visit our website at www.ruralheritage.com.